Good morning, quilters. There we go. Sorry about that. Good morning, quilters. This is day 3 of Quilt Canada, and this is our 8 a.m. Mountain Time presentation. We're gonna be going through this together. This is the Can Quilt Paisley presentation by the wonderful Leah Day. If you watched her presentation yesterday afternoon, where she taught us just a beginner swirl, which was really lovely. So without any further ado, let's switch over to Leah and let's learn how to quilt some paisleys.
Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and welcome to Grace Company's Spring Fling Quilt Festival. And this is You Can Quilt, How to Stitch Paisley Shortcut. And Paisley is kind of what I consider an oldie goldie design. It's something I stitched a lot machine, stationary, and a table. But when I moved it to my long arm, I found it really tricky. And I'm explaining why there's some tricky bits to regular Paisley and how to make it a shortcut, how to make it a little easier, a little faster to stitch. And guys, I don't know about you, but I've got a lot of quilts, a lot of baby quilts specifically that need to be quilted. And I've got one right here actually that I'm going to do some stitching on in this video. I am 4 months pregnant right now, and I don't know, something about that has been making me want to get these quilts finished and done so I can enjoy them with my new baby. So this is a perfect design. Paisley Shortcut is one of those. It's going to cover your quilt quickly, has a beautiful texture, and it's going to get your quilts finished fast. So let's learn how to quilt this together. So let's get started first, and I want to show you what I consider as the traditional Paisley. So you start with a teardrop shape, and then you're going to return to your starting position, pivot, and echo around it. And so that's what I'm doing right now. And it really helps if the teardrop shapes are kind of done in one nice long sweeping movement, because that's just going to minimize wiggles and wobbles. To move on with the design, you're just going to form another teardrop shape in another direction, pivot, swing around it, and then a lot of times I would intentionally travel stitch. So I would intentionally stitch along my previous stitching and kind of build up thread. And that was something that I did a lot with my home sewing machine, just to add more drama to the design, to make the design look slightly darker, as in, more thread building up. Now I am using my bag of beans again. If you remember from my video on basic spiral, this is a 1 pound bag of beans that I just place on top of my quilt, which is over my ruler base and the machine base, so the machine bed, and that just gives me a little bit more weight and a little bit more control. So it is absolutely possible to quilt Paisley, as you can see, but to be honest, this is just a little bit on the messy side. I'm wiggling and wobbling. I'm kind of stitching lava Paisley or demented Paisley a little bit more here than, really nice teardrop shapes. And it feels really challenging. This feels slow. I feel like I have to practically hold my breath just to try and stitch this nicely. And that can be a little distracting. I think definitely more practice would be the solution, but quite honestly what I found is simplifying the design really, really works. So instead of all that travel stitching, we're going to swing around and we're going to hook. And what a hook is it basically is coming around the shape, and instead of coming back and travel stitching and reconnecting with the base of that teardrop shape, I'm instead coming close and then changing directions. I'm pivoting before I come in contact with the previous line of stitching. So let's continue. I'm going to show you how to turn this into Paisley Shortcut. So I'm going to form a teardrop shape, but it's not going to be a complete teardrop. I'm going to come close, then I'm going to pivot and swing around. Pivot and swing around. Now, I am in a narrow space here. This is a very narrow space. This is a 2-inch, let's say, sashing. So obviously, I'm going to run up against those edges. You run up into the ditch of your block. You're going to have to be able to travel stitch along it, swing out, and then form another shape. Now, this is kind of ending up so that they're stacking up together and kind of the same shape repeating. Doesn't necessarily have to be that way. You can mix it up and you can form these in all different directions. But that is the basis for our Paisley shortcut. We still have the same, the same basic idea, the same principle as Paisley, but it's a lot easier and it's a lot faster. I hope you can see I'm just swinging around super fast. When I need to, I can travel stitch along those edges of my blocks, edges of my quilting spaces. But for the most part, I'm really rocking and rolling with this. And it makes it such a speedy feel, such a perfect design if you are needing to get some serious quilting done and knock out those bed quilts, those baby quilts really quickly. So I'm coming down here, and I think I'm going to run out of quilting space here because I have my quilt set up pretty far forward on my frame. So I'm going to come over here and we're going to break thread. We're going to move over to a nice open block where we can expand this even more. So remember back to scale. Scale is the amount of space between your lines of quilting. So here it was a little bit less than 1/2 of an inch of space between my lines of quilting. So that's, it's, I would say, a medium scale. It's not super, super dense, but it's also not super open either. So something like this, 100% cotton batting is going to result in a nice soft quilt. But if I was using a poly batting or something that had less shrink to it, this would take a little while in quilting on this scale for the quilt to start feeling soft. So let's see what happens when we expand this, when we blow it up and make it bigger, and how that works, like what we think about as we expand those shapes and make Paisley shortcut a lot larger. Okay, so the first thing I think about whenever I'm quilting, I'm trying to quilt bigger, is I think bigger spaces, bigger shapes. Usually whenever I'm trying to quilt something very, very quickly and on a very large scale, I'm aiming to cover a good solid 4 inches of space with the full cluster of the design. What do I mean by that? Full cluster of the design is the teardrop shape and then a few echoes. So the first teardrop shape could come out and be 3 inches long or more, and then 1 or 2 echoes would get me into that size. So this is really going to be a majorly supersized Paisley shortcut. So here we go. Swing around. Now as I'm swinging around, I'm expanding that distance. So as I'm coming out of those spaces and swinging around, I'm thinking about the distance that I want between those lines of quilting, and I'm continuing to pull the long arm towards me until I get that nice distance. Now let's form another one, kind of angle it down a little bit. And there's no correct number of echoes, so you can go around once, you can go around 10 times if you wanted to. It's really, for me, what I'm always thinking about is where it will get me where I want to go. So here I want to go around, and I might end up having to do some travel stitching. If I had gone around the other way, that probably would have been better. But it's no big deal. As you can see, you just flow through the design, you just continue forming those shapes, and it's very quick. Now, it's okay to sometimes bring your lines closer together. Like here, it was mostly just a control thing. The long arm wanted to get a little closer there, and I need my bag of beans. I need to bring that closer, and that way I get that little bit of control back on the quilt, and then I'm pushing the long arm. I'm telling where I want it to go. The bag of beans definitely helped with that travel stitching right there, and also enabled me to stitch really neatly into that little space. Now let's really go for size. And we're going to swing out really far. Come in only a little bit, swing out really far. Honestly, the biggest challenge is moving too fast. So you're swinging out, and that's, in my opinion, that's what's really giving me these beautiful curves and a lot less wobble, because I'm moving more quickly. The downside is that it's actually possible to move so quickly that you move too fast for your stitch regulator. You got to watch out for that. You've got to keep it within the speed that your machine can go. So that is looking great. As I come out, I'm going to fill that area fully. And then one more right here. Now if I wanted to, I could be a little persnickety with it and fill in that little area. But quite honestly, I could have just, come right up against that edge. Any of those choices would have been just fine. So I'll break thread and we will roll over and check that out. I want you to see just how pretty this design is. And, does it have the exact same texture as regular Paisley? No. You don't have the thread buildup. You don't have, those areas of intensity where the teardrops and all of the echoes come together. However, I think this forms a really nice all over texture. It has lots of movement. It's obviously really easy to expand it so it covers lots of space. And what's nice about that is that's going to ensure faster finish quilts and softer quilts. So if you're really going for super cuddly softness, this is going to be a great choice. Okay, but what if you want something super, super special and you need to shrink this down in order to quilt it around something else? Let's say an applique or a motif, some sort of design. Well, that's not difficult either. Just like, Paisley can be quilted on any scale, just like basic spiral can be quilted on any scale. It's all about just shrinking the distance between these lines of quilting. So if I start out with a smaller teardrop shape and my echoes are smaller, maybe pinky finger width, or a 1/4 inch apart, then it's of course going to result in a tighter design. So here we go. Smaller teardrop shape, pivot, echo, pivot, and echo. Now, I like to use my ruler foot, and I leave it pretty much on my machine all the time. And I like the ruler foot because it gives me that 1/4 inch spacing. So from my needle to the edge of the foot is a 1/4 inch. So if I'm aiming to quilt on a 1/4 inch scale, technically I should be running up against that line of stitching. So let's try that again. I'm going to stitch a teardrop shape. And I'm going to try and go around the teardrop with the edge of the foot. As you can see, obviously I don't really think that way, like that isn't something I focus on. I'm focusing more on the hand movement, the way my hands are moving the handlebars, because I wobbled a little bit because I was focusing and I was looking on the edge of the foot versus just focusing on what my hands were doing. So it's really funny to kind of think through this, in a different way. A lot of times when I'm stitching a design, I'm not really thinking about it because I've memorized these little steps, all of these little nuances, the back and forth, how the design works. And so that's just something I've memorized. And then how I actually quilt it in a real quilt is I quilt it in rows. So exactly like what I've started here, I'm quilting from left to right. And I'm filling basically a 2 to 4 inch row across my quilt. Now this row can be wider, it can be narrower, it just really depends on what's comfortable for you. But I pretty much always fill like this, whether I'm quilting on a long arm on a frame or I'm quilting on a home machine and a table. I always fill in a logical way, meaning I start in one space and I fill that whole space up as much as I can. And then once I fill, basically from left to right, I come down and then fill from right to left. And there's a reason why, I don't fill basically a solid 4 inch row is because I want to be able to interlock these rows together. That kind of helps to disguise what I've done, right? It helps to hide the fact that I'm quilting in rows because I can interlock them together and you really can't see that's how I've quilted it. And now I'm going to work my way up into this area and interlock these shapes with what I've stitched before. Some of them are going to have to get a little bit smaller. Some of them are going to have to be a little bit bigger. It just depends on the space that I'm trying to fill. So here I think I can come in with one teardrop, one nice hook, bounce around that, and then come down, ready to fill in another row coming in below. So quilting in rows, it really doesn't require an adjustment in your thinking, just so much as just thinking about how you're going to work your way through an area, not really in a line, but just, filling it fully so that it's the easiest to fill and you're not going to stitch yourself into a corner. I find that when I stitch randomly all over something, like let's say I just, kind of was freewheeling it and kind of stitching over here a little bit, I would leave this whole area blank and then I have to come back later and fill it. So by quilting in rows, I'm looking at the space I have to fill and trying to stitch it in the most logical way. So it's filled quickly and it's filled efficiently, so I don't have to come back later and stitch into that area. I can just knock it out as I go, and it's all uniformly filled. I also don't have, empty spaces within the center of a block or something like that, or the center of my quilt, where it would be really clunky to try and come in and fill that in and have thread breaks and all that kind of stuff. By working in rows, I minimize all of that. I can nest these rows together, and I can even do something like that, something that we pulled out a basic spiral if I need to, if I don't have the space for a whole teardrop shape and Paisley shortcut. You can always break the rules a little bit, modify it, whatever you need to do in order to get that nice texture stitched over your quilt. So I'm finishing this one up, and you can see just how nice this looks. Really, it doesn't take that much time. It's a very fast design. And the wonderful thing is just this nice, I would say almost floral texture. I think this is slightly on the, girly side. This would be a design that I think is more feminine. That's just how I think of it. But I think it looks really, really perfect for baby quilts, bed quilts, something you're wanting to get done. If you wanted to make it more masculine, then you would change it to pointy Paisley shortcut, which is a triangle shape. So instead of a teardrop, which is a nice curve, come in with a triangle shape and then echo with straight lines and sharp angles. It's a little bit more challenging. Straight lines can be hard to stitch without having them wiggle and wobble, but that is another great design to stitch as well. Now, I have said before, quilting on a real quilt feels totally different from quilting on a practice sandwich. So I have switched over to my hoop frame, and I have a Janome 1600. This is a home sewing machine on my Hoop Frame Pro, and I am going to stitch our Paisley shortcut through this area on this real baby quilt. So I'm going to get started. I am using a Sure Stitch regulator that's helping to keep my stitches all the same size and shape. So just like I use a regulator on my Unique 21, I also use a regulator on my home sewing machine as well. Now, it's definitely different when you are quilting on a real quilt because, of course, there's that stress and pressure. You don't want to mess up. You don't want to wobble. So I'm being very careful. I'm honestly trying to hold my breath and talk at the same time, which is utterly impossible. But, calm down, keep a light hand on your carriage, and just smoothly make these movements. It's not a race. Now, something really important that I actually stopped the machine and really stopped to think about, and that is how much space I have to quilt into. When you are working on a home sewing machine especially, you have less space to work in. And I'm kind of shifted the quilt so that way it pretty much fits perfectly within that space. And it's a really good idea before you get started to pull your machine as far forward as you can go, mark that with 1/4 inch masking tape, pull it as far back as you can go, mark that with 1/4 inch masking tape. And that way you can visually see on the quilt how far you can stitch out. And that's going to prevent you from accidentally running into basically the end of your frame and accidentally then stitching a straight line when you really want to stitch a curve. Okay, so I'm going to click this back on. And yep, it looks like I can get about 1/2 inch from my seam line here. So I'm going to be within that seam line, which is just fine. I don't really want to quilt this quilt densely. I want it to be a nice soft baby quilt. So I'm going to try and remember that I can quilt pretty much about up to that. That's where my stitching can go. I have a ruler foot here on my Janome 1600. So really the edge of the foot is going to come 1/4 inch from that tape. So there we go. That's a better marker. so that way I don't accidentally stitch through the tape. Okay, so now I think I'm going to take my Paisley, and just like I have done with basic spiral, I can plan this design out. I want to be able to swing back and then stitch it in this area. So I think I want to form one here, or maybe if I stitch it this way, then I'll curl back. So this is another thing, how you hook that, and turn around, that's going to determine your next echo, and I'd rather that. So I'm going to swing out, form that one, and then swing over to form the one over here. So here we go. Swing out, nice little teardrop shape, swing over. Another thing is, because we've got these stops, these hooks, these points, that's a great place to stop your machine. Just turn it off. And I'm using my button on my stitch regulator here. Of course, if you have a foot pedal, you can just take your foot off the gas and then stop and think about it. So here in this case, I want to swing out this way and then come back this way. So that little bit of planning can really make a difference. And especially if you are just learning this design, you're just getting the hang of it, then it might be a good idea to plan, every 2 or 3, just to stop, click the machine off and go, okay, well, what's next? Am I going to go this way and then maybe come down? I like that idea. Let's see here. I'm going to come that way. Yep. And then hook down. Now let's talk about scale. I've emphasized that a lot because this is the thing that determines how long it takes to quilt your quilt. If you quilt on a dense scale, well, you may be quilting that quilt for a while. Now this is a case of I wasn't really thinking. I was talking and focusing too much on that, and I have kind of hit the edge of what I can quilt here. So I'm going to kind of try and shift the quilt back a little bit, give myself a little bit more room, shift the bulk here a little upward, and then see if I can maybe push this a little bit and stitch this last little swing out a little closer. We'll see. Yep, at least I did not manage to stitch a straight line there. Okay, so basically what happened was the back of my machine was rubbing up against the back of the quilt. By shifting it a little bit, I was able to get myself, just that little bit of extra space to be able to complete that echo. This was a good situation where, stop, turn the machine off, pause, think about it, trace your finger over it. If you have to, mark it. In this case, I want to swing out this way and then come back that way. So especially when I am closer to that bottom edge, which is harder for me to visualize, that I'm coming up to it, because I know I can see the bulk of the quilt here, and when I get close to that, I know better than to get too close to it. But down here, I don't really know where that edge is, where that edge of my quiltable space is, so I have to kind of stop and think about it. All right, so in this one, I'm going to swing out this way and then come back this way. Swing out. And this is resulting in most of my Paisleys having, the same number of echoes. Not the end of the world. I don't think anyone's going to look at your quilt and count. No one's going to be like, oh, wow, all of your Paisleys have one echo. No, nobody cares. No one's going to be thinking about that. And as you can see, roughly I am quilting on that 1/2 inch scale, which I have a very thin polyester batting in this quilt. I think this is going to result really nice. In these other areas that I have to quilt, I'm only going to stitch this Paisley shortcut through this space. I can widen my lines and have them a little further apart, and that will result in a softer finish. All right, so here we go. This is going to be tricky. I need to make sure, maybe come out this way, swing back this way, and then form, actually, I think I want to come out with a long one and then hook that way. I think that's a better idea. Yeah, so sometimes even I, with a little bit of more thought, will change my mind and realize, oh wow, that's a better choice. That was a better choice right there, and that looks great. This one I think is gonna get a little tight again, and it's just that, you gotta be always thinking about the direction of those echoes and how they're gonna stack up. So let's try and just totally freehand this. It's a little tricky because I can't see behind the foot on the machine. That can be a little bit of a struggle sometimes. But I work my way in and I work my way out, and that worked out just fine. Now I gotta say, having a stitch regulator really, it just makes this so much easier. It takes out one thing in the equation that I have to think about, and that would be regulating my speed, keeping my stitches the same size by matching the speed of my carriage moving, my hands moving the machine on the carriage, and then the machine needle going up and down. So the stitch regulator is taking care of the needle. It's basically reading the speed that I am moving, and then it's working to keep those stitches nice and small and consistent. Now, every once in a while I speed up a little bit and go a little too fast, and as you can see, the stitches get a little bit bigger. So it's not perfect, but for the most part, as long as I'm stitching fairly slowly, it really works well. And again, here I've got that tricky spot right up against that edge. I'm going to swing out this way and then back this way. So I want to make that one kind of small, so that way I can swing out nicely. Perfect. Now let's make kind of a good. Now I ended up with a little bit of a straight line right there. But again, I don't think anyone's going to, be looking for that kind of thing on your quilts. Like, I felt the machine kind of bump up against that front edge. So I know that I was right on my limit right there, but that's okay. This is still looking good. And this is a situation where, yes, the lines came a little closer together, but I'm not going to go and rip that out. I think that's just fine. Still looks more than good enough on this baby quilt. And it's getting it done. This baby quilt has been sitting around for so long, it still had basting pins in it. I, of course, don't need to baste my quilts anymore because I quilt on frames. But that's how long this quilt has been sitting around waiting to be quilted. I had it all basted up and ready to go, ready to quilt on a home sewing machine. And then realized, I really don't need to quilt it that way. I can absolutely quilt this on a frame. All right, so getting into here, of course this fabric is pretty busy, but I want to go on ahead and quilt all the way down to this corner, and then I could change direction if I wanted to. Keep going. The nice thing about a hoop frame is you have a little bit more freedom when it comes to how you hoop your quilt, how it actually goes on the frame. And here you can see a picture of how I've mounted this quilt. I've actually mounted this quilt on the diagonal because I could then quilt this whole section, as you can see, in one big row, and that's going to speed things up. So I'd have to do fewer hoopings and I can get it done faster, right? It's all about the speed. And for that reason, I'm going to get a little bit bigger with my Paisleys, knock these out a little faster. I think I can squeeze one more echo in here. There we go. That looks great. Now I think I'm going to go on ahead and come all the way across, just because these are the trickiest spots. I'm going to go on ahead and come all the way across with my Paisley shortcut, and then I'll work my way up and back. And that's A-okay. At any time you can decide, hey, I want to work in this direction. Now I'm feeling I've got something here. I think I've got just a little bit of extra weight here on my quilt, and that was causing it to push down. A little bit of a wiggle wobble there. Not the end of the world. Don't rip out your stitches. It's not the end of the world if you accidentally make a mistake. As I swing around, I carefully, slowly swing around. I want you to show you that adding another echo to that really just kind of solved it. It really hid that mistake. That's a great way of doing it. Now, I don't often quilt like this. I don't often go on ahead and stitch to the end and then come back because, of course, I'm kind of quilting blind. I'm stitching behind myself. I can't really see what I'm doing. I just made a big mistake there. That's okay. And so this is a little bit on the tricky side, just simply because I can't quite see how these are going to fit. But I think they're going to fit A-okay. So one more shape, and I'm going to dead end right there. And what I'll probably do is kind of shift the quilt ever so slightly down so that way I can actually dead end in a ditch. So there we go. That is Paisley shortcut in a real quilt. And yes, it is a little bit more stressful. It feels different to quilt a real quilt, but it is very rewarding because it lets you say, hey, I'm getting my real quilt stitched up and finally finished. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed learning how to quilt Paisley shortcut, both on a practice sandwich and in a real quilt. I will admit, whenever you switch to a real quilt, it can be stressful. Try and take deep breaths, calm yourself down, understand that every single stitch, every single line, every single curve does not have to be absolutely perfect. Really, the key is to get lots and lots and lots of repetitions of that shape. The more you do that, the better you're going to get at it and the easier it's going to feel. But you're not going to accomplish anything. You're not going to gain any skill if you spend all of your time ripping out one or two bad stitches. So keep that in mind. Keep quilting.
Hello, and thank you for being with us while we watched that wonderful presentation by Leah Day on how to quilt Paisleys. I know I really appreciated the time and attention she took to teaching us how to worry about how to think about the scale and the space that the designs are going into. I loved that presentation. I'm just looking to see if there's any questions, and I don't see any at the moment, but feel free to call us on our toll-free number. I'll put that up on the screen now. If you do have any questions between now and our next presentation, which is at 12 o'clock noon Mountain Standard Time, which is in about 3.5 hours. Our next presentation is a workshop by Carla Jerome called Striptease, which should be very exciting. She's mentioned it several times to me, and I'm excited to finally be able to enjoy that workshop that she's put so much time and energy into. Anyway, if you guys haven't had a chance, please go by our website, www.graceframe.ca, to enjoy all of the fabulous Quilt Canada promotions we have on. Or you can stop by the Quilt Canada booth at you can stop by the Grace Company Canada booth at Quilt Canada. Debbie is asking, can we find these quilt presentations online? Yeah, we can find them online. A lot of these presentations actually come from the Grace Company USA's Spring Fling last month, so you can find them there, or you can always find them on our own YouTube channel, where they should be recorded. You can also find most of them on the Facebook page. So. If you have any other questions, Debbie, feel free to give us a call, and I'm sure we'll be able to find the answers for you. And I'll try my best to find a link that you can put these in. Are you looking for the Leah Day presentation specifically, or just all the presentations? Let me know, and I will post a link that would be appropriate. Thanks so much for watching, and I will look forward to seeing you guys at 12 noon for the workshop with Carla. All right, have a good one.